Hello everyone and welcome to the Sky this month for November 2022. My name's Paul Martinaitis and this show is brought to you by the Astronomical Society of South Australia. So it's quite an exciting month in the sky in November. The viewing of Saturn and Jupiter that we've been doing over the previous couple of months, that of course continues. There's some interesting events, particularly on Jupiter, which we'll discuss later on in the show. Neptune's still very well placed for observation. Uranus is coming up to opposition, so you'll be able to take a look at that as well. In fact, you'll be able to look at all of the outer planets all in one night, if you so wish. And of course, the big thing is, well, two big things. We've got the lunar eclipse happening on the 8th of November, and also Mars is coming up to opposition in early December. So now is a great time to begin viewing Mars as well. So we'll get to all that very shortly, but before we do, we'll just take a look at the sky more generally. So we'll begin in the western part of the sky. So the great winter constellations of Scorpius and Sagittarius, they're well and truly done for the year. I think Scorpius, you can just see the tail licking above the horizon, and then Sagittarius really won't be far behind it. So looking further up, there's Capricorn. So Saturn is still in Capricorn, still very well placed at the moment. And right next to Saturn, you might wish to take a look at the Saturn Nebula, one of the few reasonable deep sky objects in Capricorn, actually. So you can take a look at the Saturn Nebula, so called because it has that, under good conditions, you can see these kind of two extensions, which kind of give you a little bit of an impression or a reminder of the rings of Saturn. And then after you've taken a look at that, you can, of course, look at the planet Saturn as well. Further across to the top left, we can see Pavo the Peacock, in addition to some nice galaxies in that part of the sky. Don't forget to take a look at NGC 6752, or the so-called Pavo Globular. Probably the third or fourth best globular in the sky after Omega Centauri and 47 Tuc. And further up again, we have Grus, home of a number of galaxies, in particular the Grus Quartet, which we discussed in a previous show. So you might want to take a look at that as well. So looking to the north now, we can see this part of the sky is really dominated by Pegasus, the flying horse, in particular the great square of Pegasus, which forms the body. So there's Jupiter, nice and bright and pretty high up still. So Jupiter and Saturn nicely placed for observation, and we'll talk a bit more about them a little bit later in the show. Last month we talked about Andromeda and the great spiral M33 and Triangulum. So still a good time to observe those objects if you haven't already. Just make sure that you have a nice dark sky, and also you do need a fairly unobstructed view to the north, because unfortunately these objects never rise that high above the horizon for us here in the south. Moving now a little bit more towards the northeast, there's Cetus, the whale, and there's actually a nice object in Cetus, not far actually from Jupiter at this time of year, which I would like to show you. So I'll just zoom in a little bit. So it's sort of relatively easy to find because it's inside this almost equilateral triangle which forms the head of Cetus. So this is NG 246, sometimes called the Skull Nebula or Pac-Man Nebula. So this is a little bit different to, say, the Saturn Nebula, which is quite a relatively small planetary nebula. This one is much larger in apparent diameter. So this shows you a simulated view of about almost 190 times through my 12-inch telescope. Still has quite a high surface brightness, so you can certainly still crank up the magnification. And like most planetary nebula, it will respond quite strongly to an O3 filter. And so what you'll see is, depending on how good the conditions are and how large your telescope is, you'll see a relatively large grey disk, quite mottily and ragged around the edges, has two distinctive bright stars in it that appear like they're inside of the nebula, even though, of course, they're not part of the actual nebula itself. And on one edge, you'll see a sort of a hollowed out bit, which is much darker, which I guess is why some people might call it the Pac-Man Nebula. So it's a really nice planetary nebula, and there's some nice detail to be brought out in it, particularly if you're looking at it using an O3 filter. So looking east now, we can see that summer's must be just around the corner, because here's Orion peaking, and Canis Major peaking above the horizon. So as the legend goes, of course, Orion and Scorpius are mortal enemies of one another, so they were set at diametrically opposite sides of a celestial sphere. So as Scorpius is setting, Orion rises, and vice versa. So they kind of chase each other for eternity around the sky. Nice story. Anyway, so at the moment, I think the Orion Nebula, which of course is a favourite object of many of us, a little bit low for observing at 10 p.m. But if you're staying up another couple of hours to say midnight or so, I think it should have risen to a decent height and would be worth a look. Another constellation in this part of the sky, a big one, is Eridanus, the river, and that, of course, winds its way, one of the longest constellations, winds its way all the way from Orion, all the way across the sky to Achernar, the relatively bright star Achernar in the south. Looking a little bit further up, we have Fornax and Sculptor. So in a previous show, we discussed some of the fine galaxies in Sculptor, including, of course, NGC 253, the so-called Silver Coin Galaxy, and NGC 55. And there's also Fornax, which has a lot of nice galaxies in it as well. One in particular, which I think a lot of you would know, but really well placed at this time of year, is NGC 1365. It's probably one of the easiest galaxies. If you want to see arms in a galaxy, this would be probably the galaxy where it's easiest to see those arms. So we'll just have a quick look where that is and what that looks like. So I placed the Telrad circles where you can find NGC 1365. You can see there that in practice, it's closer to Eridanus than Fornax, but it's still regarded as being part of the Fornax constellation, because you can see I've just switched the boundaries on. So just to keep consistency, each constellation has an official boundary. So you can see that Fornax, the boundary goes all the way, and in fact even crosses that line of Eridanus in this part of the sky. So there's 1365, just inside the boundary in Fornax. So we'll just zoom in a little bit more to take a look. So you can see just below, of course, there's a whole heap of galaxies here. So that's the Fornax cluster of galaxies. And you can spend a whole evening just hopping from one galaxy to another in this region of the sky. But we'll just go a little bit closer. So there's 1365, and that gives you a reasonable impression of what it can look like in the eyepiece. So if you can imagine this shape here, certainly through, the arms have been seen in telescopes as small as, to my knowledge, an 8, but certainly in a 12-inch telescope, I have no difficulty seeing the bright core. You can see a bar, and certainly this part of the arm here, and here, these curved bits are relatively bright, and usually I can see them with direct vision. I don't even have to use averted vision. These bits that curl around, I only get a vague impression of occasionally under the darkest of skies using averted vision. But the bright part of the arm, that bit that sweeps out to there, and that bit that sweeps out to there, is usually quite apparent. As long as you're under a dark sky and properly dark adapted. So if you've got a reasonably sized telescope and you want to see some arms in a galaxy, this is certainly the one I would go for, NGC 1365. A wonderful, wonderful object. So let's finally take a look at the south. So You might recall earlier in the year we spoke a lot about the Argo Navis constellations of Carina, Puppis, Vela and Pyxis. And for a while there, of course, they went very close to the horizon, with Vela dipping pretty much completely below the horizon. But now, you know, things have really turned around. That's actually starting to rise again. So in a couple of months' time, we'll be able to start looking at some of the fine objects in this part of the sky as well, including, of course, the Eta Carini Nebula, which is kind of around here. So there's Canopus, of course, part of Carina, the second brightest star in the sky after Sirius. There's the large Magellanic Cloud, still quite well placed for observation. The small Magellanic Cloud over here. And then we also have the constellations of, amongst others, Dorado and Reticulum. So Dorado is another one of these constellations in the south, which with quite a few nice galaxies. Just one I want to point out to you is 1566. So it's just at the tip there, near the top of those two bright, relatively bright stars at the end of Dorado. And it's a really nice galaxy. And a little bit like 1365, it's actually quite relatively easy. I won't say easy, but relatively easy to see the spiral arms. So if we zoom in a bit more to this photo, in my 12-inch telescope, using reasonable magnification, I can see this inner spiral. So I can't see these outer loops here, but I can see the core, and I can see these little hook things, these little inner twists that you can see highlighted in white there. Usually I need averted vision to see that though, so it's a little bit dimmer or less distinct than 1365. But this galaxy, being a little bit smaller and with a high surface brightness at the core, does bear magnification quite well. So give that one a shot as well when you've got your telescope out. So looking at the calendar for November, we can see that the dark sky window, when the moon won't interfere with our deep sky observations, that begins at about the 14th and goes through to the 25th. So it's a narrower window than usual. So on the 25th, the reason for that is the moon begins to, doesn't set until the beginning of astronomical twilight. So if you are happy to delay starting observation a little bit later than 10 p.m, you can extend that dark sky window right through to the end of November. So, for example, by the 30th of November, the moon will be setting at around midnight. So, you know, you could do some planetary observing earlier in the evening, and then after midnight, the moon would have set, and then you can get stuck into the galaxies and all the stuff that needs a dark sky. So in terms of astronomical twilight, at the beginning of the month, darkness began at around 9:20 and went through to 4:36 in the morning. By the end of November, we're looking at about 9:50 before it gets truly dark, and it will go through to 4:15 in the morning. So in terms of moon phases, first quarter was on the 1st, full moon is on the 8th. And speaking of the 8th, that is also a total lunar eclipse. So that is on Tuesday. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next. Last quarter was on the 16th, and new moon will be on the 24th. So taking a look at the solar system now, we'll first look at the inner planets, Mercury and Venus, and you can see they begin the month really virtually in conjunction with the Sun, and they'll remain unobservable pretty much for the entirety of November. Towards the end of November, Venus will start to emerge in the evening sky, but it will still be too close to the Sun for effective observation. So best to wait later on in the year to take a look at them in December. But there's plenty of other things to keep us busy, of course, not the least of which is the impending opposition of Mars. So you can see at the beginning of November, we're already starting to really close in on the planet. It will be about 15 to 16 arc minutes in diameter, And then as November moves on, we start to catch up to Mars, and our relative distance becomes closer and closer. So by the 30th, we'll have closest approach, and Mars will increase to its maximum diameter for this opposition of 17.1 arc minutes. And then a couple of days later, on the 8th, it will reach opposition, where it's in line with the Sun. And thereafter, of course, as we overtake Mars in our orbit, the distance between us will start to increase again. So it will then start to decrease in apparent diameter until the end of December and beyond. So really, from now, November, through to at least halfway through December, is our optimum time, the next 6 to 8 weeks, to observe Mars during this apparition. So as we mentioned before, there's a total lunar eclipse happening here in Australia. So fortunately from Adelaide, we can view most of it. So for your reference, I've listed the relative times for this event. And as usual, all times in my videos are Adelaide time. In particular, at the moment, daylight savings time. So that's plus 10.5 from universal time. So the actual umbral eclipse, in other words, when the moon started to move into the Earth's shadow, that actually began at around 7:40 or 1939. But the moon is still very low on the horizon at the beginning of that event. And it's still, of course, twilight as well. So the picture, and then the total eclipse will begin at 2046. So that's when the moon is completely in the Earth's shadow. Greatest or mid eclipse will occur, so that's when the moon will get the darkest, when it moves into the middle of the shadow. That will be at around 9:30, 21:29. The total eclipse will end at 22:12. So that's when the moon starts to move out of the Earth's shadow, and the umbral eclipse will end. In other words, that's when the moon removes itself completely from the Earth's shadow. That will occur at 23:19. So I'll just show you a sequence of simulations, just showing you what you can expect from this event. So what you see here, I think the time is about 8:30. So it's almost an hour since the umbral eclipse began. So you can see that this is the Earth's shadow here that you can see towards the right, the darker part of the moon, and it's almost covered the entire surface of the moon, but not quite, because that will occur at 2046 once a total eclipse occurs. So here we are now at 2050. So twilight has ended, so the sky is now a bit darker. The whole surface of the moon has now moved into the Earth's shadow, and it will start to turn a reddish color as well. So that reddish color is the light that's filtered through the Earth's atmosphere, illuminating the moon. So the more dust and smoke in the Earth's atmosphere, due to things like volcanoes and such things, they can affect the color of the moon during a total eclipse. So some eclipses are redder than others. So here we are now at around 9:30. So that's around the time of total eclipse. So this will be when the moon is darkest, and hopefully it'll turn a nice intense red color. And notice too, we'll talk more about that shortly, Uranus is also, as a bonus, very close to the moon. Well, it's at opposition on the 9th, and it's also very close to the moon during this eclipse. So maybe while you're enjoying the totality of this eclipse, around 9:30, if you've got your binoculars or telescope out, it's a good chance to look for Uranus as well. I think it's within about a degree of the moon. So now we skip forward to 22:12, or about 12 past 10, and you can see this is now the end of the total eclipse. So the bottom part of the moon it will start to look a bit brighter and silvery. So in other words, the moon is now starting to move out of the umbra, or the Earth's shadow. And then there's 2225. So you can see progressively over the next hour or so, you'll see the moon start to brighten up as it moves out of the Earth's umbra. So there's 2240. And then it officially ends at about 2320. So the moon is now free of the Earth's shadow. So as I mentioned, during the total lunar eclipse, Uranus is actually very close to the moon. In fact, it's about a degree away, so you could technically fit it in the same field of view. So it's a good time while you're looking at the total eclipse. If you got your binoculars out or your telescope, take a look for Uranus, which will appear, I think, on the western side of the moon. In fact, in the next slide, that sort of shows you a simulated view through 10 by 42 binoculars under a dark sky. So Uranus at the moment is about magnitude 7, I think. It's not terribly dim. And particularly through a telescope, it usually has a bit of a greenish, bluish tinge. So similar looking to Neptune, but I would say Neptune is usually an intense blue. Uranus is a much lighter blue, and to my eye, a much, much lighter blue with a sort of a greenish tinge to it. It has the distinction, of course, Uranus have been the first planet to be discovered telescopically by William Herschel. So there's a couple of moons of Uranus as well, which you might care to try and observe. You definitely want to only do this under a really dark sky. So Uranus has it has many moons, but the 4 bright ones that are really within reach of reasonable instruments are shown here. So this would be the configuration on the 8th of November at around 9:30. So you have Titania at magnitude 13.5, Ariel 13.7, Oberon 13.7, and Umbriel at 14.5. So these moons, they are quite close to Uranus, so you'll have to use, not as close as Triton is to Neptune, but they're still quite close nonetheless. So you need to use plenty of magnification, a dark sky, and you probably need a reasonably large telescope. I would say an 8-inch, certainly a 10-inch should comfortably, under good conditions, be able to see Oberon, Ariel, and Titania. Umbriel at 14.5 in a 12-inch would be not too difficult, provided the sky is dark enough, but you would need good dark adaptation to see that. And the other thing is, I find if you've got access to an app such as Sky Safari, that can be very useful, taking proper precautions, of course, to protect your night vision. That can be a good way of identifying where the particular moons are in relation to the planet, so you can confirm your observations. So, like I said before, this is actually a good opportunity to see all of the outer planets. So this view here shows you 4 of them. So this is looking on the 11th of November at about 10 p.m. in the evening. So up high to the left, so going from left to right, there'll be Saturn. Further along, quite near Jupiter still, is Neptune. Then you have Jupiter. And finally, all the way to the right there, you have Uranus as well. So you can actually observe those 4 planets earlier in the evening or later in the evening, I guess. And then later on, when Mars rises, you can take a look at that as well. So Saturn, of course, always worth a look, together with its family of moons. One interesting thing that's kind of occurring on the 11th of November is Saturn reaches what's called quadrature. So the consequence of that is on and around the 11th. I don't think it'd make much difference a week or two before or after the 11th either, but the shadow that the planet makes on its rings becomes more distinct, and I've marked it with an arrow there. So it's that sort of dark line that you can see across the rings often behind the planet. So that will become very distinct on and around the 11th of November. So a good time to be observing Saturn. And finally, of course, we have Jupiter. So there's a lot of moon events, as usual, in addition to enjoying the disk of the planet itself. Now, there's a particular event on the 6th of November, which I'd just like to highlight for you. It's quite soon after this video comes out, so I hope you have time to have a look at the video, and even more so, let's hope that it's a clear night. So the forecasts currently are that there is a high likelihood of it being clear on Sunday night for this event. So firstly, there's a shadow transit of Europa. Whilst that shadow transit is still occurring, Io will be in eclipse and will reappear as well. And then a little bit later on, Ganymede will go into eclipse and disappear. So you have a shadow transit, you'll have one of the moons reappearing from eclipse whilst the shadow transit is occurring, and Ganymede will disappear. Again, just note that I have linked a file, just as I have for the last two videos, where I'll list the events for November and December for Jupiter and its moons. So please refer to that for other events that may be convenient for you to observe as well. So finally, last but certainly not least, let's talk about Mars. So this shows you where Mars is on the mid-month, on about the 15th, at around 4 a.m. in the morning. So it's in Taurus at the moment, Taurus the bull, and it'll make like a nice contrast. You have the beautiful bright red Mars, and of course we've got that bright star Aldebaran there in Taurus. So unfortunately for this opposition, not only is it the diameter is reasonable at 17.1, but a sort of a compounding factor is unfortunately the maximum altitude, the culmination altitude of Mars is not very high. In fact, it's only about 30 degrees. So it means even when Mars appears at its highest, we're still looking through quite a bit of atmosphere. It's much nicer when it appears higher for us. But for this opposition, that's not the case, and it won't be for many years to come. So what that means is really to get a good view of the planet, or assuming that it's clear, of course, and not cloudy, you really want to view it near its transit time. In other words, where it's near its peak altitude. You don't want to be looking at it when it's near the horizon. So what I've done just for your convenience is just drawn a little table here for you, which you may want to just pause and take a note of. So for what I've done for these various dates is I've listed the diameter of Mars, the apparent diameter. So on the 15th, for example, it'll be 16.5 arc minutes. And more importantly, I've listed the transit time. So mid-November, it will transit at 4 a.m. So really, you should be observing it an hour before or after that. So between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. would be optimal. Outside of that window, it's just too near the horizon, I think. By the end of November, fortunately, this transit time will come forward. So by the end of November, it'll reach its maximum size of 17.2, and it will culminate at about 2 a.m. And then into December, by the 8th, it'll transit at 1 a.m. And then by the end of December, unfortunately, it would have grown a little bit smaller, but it will culminate at 11 p.m. So you'd be able to observe it any time between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. And again, just a reminder, Mars won't be this large again until 2031. So let's take advantage of it while we can. So just a few things to look out for. I've been self-indulgent enough to put up one of my own images that I took in the 2020 opposition. So this gives you an idea of some of the features you can look out for. And actually, on that particular night I took that image, I also did quite a bit of viewing through the eyepiece. And when it was a good night of seeing, and when the atmosphere steadied, I could actually see much of the detail that you can see in this image. So you can see up the top there, you can sometimes see a white region on one end of the globe, and that will be one of the polar caps, which of course on Mars is not water ice like it here on Earth. It's actually dry ice or solid carbon dioxide, and they vary a lot in size seasonally as Mars moves closer and further away from the sun. You'll often also see a bit of atmospheric haze as well that you can see there in the lower left of the globe. There'll also be various dark markings. So I've just labelled a few of the key ones that happen to be visible when I took this image. Around the other side is a very famous landmark, Syrtis Major, a very conical type of marking. And the other great thing about Mars is it's a very dynamic planet. So there's things like winds and dust storms, and those dust storms, as they shift the sand around, they can change the appearance of the surface quite a bit. And sometimes you can even see clouds as well towards the middle of the disk. So this view here would represent an excellent view. And by the way, at this opposition 2020, you can see there that the diameter was considerably better at 22.6 arc minutes. But this one at 17 is still by no means bad. So I've shown you this image here. This was an image I took during the infamous 2018 opposition. So some of you may remember that was our last most favourable opposition. The diameter was 24 arc minutes, but unfortunately there was a global dust storm, as luck would have it. So, and this dust storm raged for several months and pretty much covered the entire planet. So this shows you, and this was the best image I was able to obtain through that dust storm. But I sort of included it for two reasons. One, to show you, well, you can never quite tell what's going to happen on Mars. And the other thing is, this kind of represents what you might see during the eyepiece on a less than optimal view compared to the previous image. So, and I would still consider this through the eyepiece quite a good view. So you might see a reddish disk, a bit of an impression of the white polar cap, and then a few sort of vague, indistinct markings on the disk. So this image actually represents still a reasonable view through the eyepiece. So just a few other final tips for Mars. Be patient. The atmosphere will govern everything when it comes to seeing this planet, notwithstanding dust storms. So try and look at it near its transit time that we saw on the table. Use as large a telescope as you can. The other thing is to make sure that your telescope has reached thermal equilibrium. So particularly if you have a Newtonian, you would want to make sure, hopefully it's got some sort of fan, or at least take it outside several hours before you observe, and try and get that mirror as cool as possible. And you just got to be patient. Some nights you'll look at it, it'll just be a red disk, you won't see anything, and then suddenly the next night, the seeing will come good. And even just for a few seconds, the detail will suddenly crisp up, and it makes it all worthwhile. Thanks everybody for joining me again. I hope you found it interesting and the information useful. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the sky at the moment, particularly in the solar system with all these planetary events occurring. So let's hope we get some clear nights, particularly for the lunar eclipse and those Jupiter events on Sunday. Have an enjoyable month of hopefully some good observing, and I look forward to seeing you in December. Bye for now.